Hello, welcome everybody to this virtual talk with John Tresch. He's the author of The Reason for the Darkness of the Night, Edgar Allan Poe and the Forging of American Science, which is actually available right now at the Poe Museum store at shop.poemuseum.org. And we're very glad to have him. We've had this book for a while now. For the past few months, we've just been trying to organize this, but John Tresch is a professor and Mellon Chair of the History of Art, Science, and Folk Practice at the Warburg Institute. He's trained in history and philosophy of science and in anthropology. His work focuses on changing methods, instruments, and institutions in the sciences, arts, and media, connecting among disciplines, cosmology, social order, and ritual, and shifting definitions of the rational and the real. He has held fellowships at the New York Public Library, the Institute for Advanced Studies, and the Max Planck Institute for the History of Science, and has been visiting researcher at King's College London and École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales. And he's just finished this book, and it looks like you're working on another book after this, Cosmograms, How to Do Things with Words, with Worlds. So we're very glad to have you. Thanks for joining us. And can you tell us a little about the reason for the darkness of the night?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. Thanks, Chris. Thanks for the introduction. Thanks so much for the invitation. It's a real honor to be here at the Poe Museum, which is this international shrine to Poe. I visited it a few years ago and met you there, heard somebody reading the Telltale Heart in the garden, and was just amazed by the incredible collection of material and images and objects that belong to Poe. And I really learned a lot while I was there. So thanks so much for putting this together. I'm going to give a little bit of an introduction to the book and a tiny reading from it. And I'm going to do that with a PowerPoint, which is kind of a magic lantern show, which is a theme that shows up a lot in the book. That was a big way in which science was communicated to people in lots of public spaces at the time that Poe was writing. And I think he's really influenced by a lot of the popular science and even the technologies for displaying science and communicating science. And I try to bring that out in the book. So I'm going to share my screen. And as Chris said, the subtitle of the book is Edgar Allan Poe and the Forging of American Science. And that forging, I think, should be heard in two ways. On the one hand, he's living through a period when American science is getting built. The foundations are being laid for it in the kind of national framework that we now take for granted. Science is establishing itself as a really authoritative way of knowing about nature, and scientists are taking on a new social and very public role. But on the other hand, it's the time of the forging of American science in the sense of forgery, because before there are national institutions, which are coming to existence right at this time, there's a lot of opportunity for quacks, charlatans, hucksters to talk about science in a way that they have no consequences, where there's no consequences, where they can make up theories and pass them off as true, do so in front of big audiences and convince a lot of people about their kind of outlandish theories. And in a way, that's a very creative moment. And Poe takes part of that in that public sphere of science, but it's also in many ways a dangerous and reckless moment because you don't know who to believe. You don't know whose theories to believe. And it's that uncertainty in the early US that Poe makes the most of, and really, I think, sheds a lot of light on works that we know very well, and that we've approached, I think, rightly through psychological approaches, aesthetic approaches, and all that's extremely important. I mean, he's the founder of the horror story. He's a massive contributor to symbolism in poetry. He invents the detective story. All these things are really important, and they're part of his life and part of the story. But I wanted to shed light on this aspect, which is his very close engagement, really through his whole life, with science and technology. So just to give you a little sense of Poe, I want to get away from the Poe that we know from this and other images like it, where he just seems like this haunted, gloomy, shattered person. And this is a picture from the end of his life, 1848, and return to an earlier moment when he's still quite optimistic, when he isn't yet terribly well known, but he's got many projects to reform American letters, to create his own magazine, and where he's actually enjoying quite a lot of success. The moment I want to look at is while he's in Philadelphia, where he arrives in 1838, and he works for a number of journals. Some of his publications from this period, in fact, the one that sold the most in his lifetime, The Conchologist's First Book, were directly about science. They were works of popular science. He works for Burton's Magazine, where he writes a series of chapters on art and science, which is basically makes him one of America's first science reporters. At the same time, he's writing fiction, publishing fiction, and writing a lot of criticism. And that's what really brings him to a lot of notoriety. When he leaves Burton's and begins working at Graham's Ladies and Gentlemen's magazine as the critic, as the literary critic. And there he writes reviews of many, many works, poetry, fiction, but also geography, science, textbooks. He really becomes a general expert on everything that's being published and doesn't hesitate to weigh in very strongly and negatively for things that he disagrees with. And this really earns him a great reputation at the same time as he's publishing many remarkable tales like The Descent into the Maelstrom, as well as starting the Dupin stories, the Murders in the Rue Morgue, the first detective story. So he's riding very high when he's at Graham's. He's the editor of this magazine, which has the biggest circulation of any in the world. At one point, Poe says it's got 50,000 subscribers, which is incredible for the time, and has quite a wide national reputation. Things are going well. He's got a nice place to live with his aunt and mother-in-law, and his wife, his young wife, Virginia, who's also his cousin. Things, however, take a turn for the worse in early 1842, when Virginia is singing accompanying herself along with the piano that they rent in their house, and bursts a blood vessel and begins bleeding from her mouth. And that's a terrifying episode. It's a sure sign of consumption or tuberculosis, and there's no cure. And from then on, right at that moment, Poe begins a very, very rapid spiral downward. He'll come back again, but at this point, it's a real crash. He leaves Graham's in a huff. After he left Graham's, his financial state was very, very uncertain. But it's there that he began to write this series of tales of guilt and horror, including the Telltale Heart. And here I'm going to read from my book. Though this tale used language and imagery from the sciences, Poe gave his readers an experience, not of certainty and reassurance, but of disorientation and horror. Opening in the middle of a conversation, maybe an asylum visit or a trial, the narrator boasts of the sharpness of his senses. True, he says, nervous, very, very dreadfully nervous I had been and am. But why will you say that I am mad? The disease had sharpened my senses, not destroyed them, not dulled them. Above all was the sense of hearing acute. I heard all things in the heaven and in the earth. I heard many things in hell. How then am I mad? Hearken and observe how healthily, how calmly I can tell you the whole story. The speaker has become fixated on the opaque eye of the old man who shares his house. One of his eyes resembled that of a vulture, a pale blue eye with a film over it. Whenever it fell on me, my blood ran cold, and so by degrees, very gradually, I made up my mind to take the life of the old man, and thus rid myself of the eye forever. He proceeds with cool, objective detachment toward an irrational goal. With patience and precision, he stalks the man, peering into his room at midnight, with a lantern open just so much that a single thin ray fell upon the vulture eye. On the seventh night, the old man awakens, sensing the intruder. After an agonizing silence, he stealthily opens his lantern until at length a single dim ray, like the thread of the spider, shot out from the crevice and full upon the vulture eye. At once he hears a low, dull, quick sound, such as a watch makes when enveloped in cotton, the beating of the terrified old man's heart, so loudly that he fears neighbors will hear it. In its detail and regularity, his description mimics the report of a meticulously designed scientific experiment. Light, which is usually a symbol of knowledge and reason, here is associated with madness. The darkened room recalls the camera obscura, the technical core of the daguerreotype, an enclosed space into which images of the outside world were projected. Yet the light that pierces this room is artificial. What's projected is the thread of a spider ensnaring its prey. The tale also restages one of the primal scenes of modern science, Isaac Newton's prism experiments in the optics. There, Newton detailed the steps through which he cracked open a shutter to let a single ray of light into a darkened room and dismembered it with a prism, thereby revealing the colors of the spectrum. Poe's tale inverts Newton's experiment, making vision and methodical reason the agents of perversity and death. He flips the heightened sensitivity of new precision instruments into a pathology, allowing his narrator to perceive many things in hell. The narrator murders the old man. Methodical as ever, he dismembers the body and buries its parts beneath the floorboards. The police arrive. He coolly entertains them, offering refreshments, placing their chairs on the guilty floorboards. He then begins to hear, once again, a constant beating, like a watch wrapped in cotton, his dead victim's heart growing louder and louder. The merciless pounding and the chatter of the police drive him to a frenzy until at last he cries out in agony, confessing his crime. Just as his desire to demonstrate his reasonable calm led to the uncovering of the murder, his heightened senses gave him access to sounds that took him beyond the limits of normal experience. By detailing an act of violent irrationality in the language of scientific method, Poe is dramatizing the dark side of the Enlightenment, a vision uncannily familiar to Americans enmeshed in an allegedly rational economic and political order defined by ruthless competition, slavery, and violent settlement, though usually presented in soothing tones of equality, freedom, and progress. Beneath the appearance of calm reason pulsed veins of terror, obsession, and cruelty. Poe gave the screw another turn. While the heart beneath the floorboards might symbolize the narrator's criminal madness, the monstrous guilt that his reason and patter cannot mask, it also echoes the ultimate symbol of method and rationality, a mechanical watch, the embodiment of the clockwork universe and the icon of natural theology and the argument from design. The tale peels back a rational surface to reveal inexplicable forces. When another layer is lifted, these forces are revealed as instruments of a deeper mechanism with a reason all its own. It also made for a damn good read. The tale has terrified school children and delighted adults since its publication.
Well, thank you for sharing with us. And I'm sure our guests here have a lot of questions, and I already have some questions that I brought with me. But first of all, I'd like to introduce Richard Kopley. He's an author. He was retired distinguished professor of English at Penn State Dubois and the author of The Threads of the Scarlet Letter, Edgar Allan Poe, the Dupin Mysteries. He's also written several other books or edited other books. This is just one of them from the library here. We have several books back there. He's written about Poe's mysteries, the narrative author Gordon Pym. He's prominent in the Poe Studies Association and in the Poe Foundation that operates the Poe Museum here in Richmond. And also I'd like to introduce Murray here. And Murray Ellison, he's not very good at being retired. He's been retired since about 2009. And since then, he went on to get his master's degree in English literature from Virginia Commonwealth University. He already had a doctorate from Virginia Tech, and his MA thesis is on Edgar Allan Poe and 19th century science. So I thought this would be a talk that's very interesting to him. He's editor of the International Correctional Educational Journal and volunteer tour guide for the Edgar Allan Poe Museum, where you might actually see him. He's actually performed as Dupin here before at one of our events. So thanks for joining us, Richard and Murray and John. And if nobody has any questions to start with, I'd like to start with you. You mentioned Poe's early poem, Sonnet to Science, very early on in the book. And in this poem, Poe really questions, how do we love science? How does the poet or the artist love science that's, you know, it's a condor whose wings are dull realities, who chases the enchantment out of the skies and the forest? And how do you think that Poe did learn to love science?
Thanks for the question. And I just want to say that it's a real pleasure and honor to be on this panel with Richard Kopley, whose works I've learned so much from and who's been extremely generous with his knowledge about Poe as I was writing. It's just a pleasure to be here again. And Murray, I'm very happy to meet you. I've learned from your writings on Poe on the Poe Museum website. So your question's great, Chris. It's such an early poem. It's the first in that collection. It's not his first collection, but it's an early collection. And it's an ode to science, this goddess. And it's a classic sonnet, 14 lines, and follows a classic rhyme structure. But instead of making an ode to a Greek goddess or a beloved woman, it's to this new goddess. And he's trying to get his head around what this new force is in the modern world and the ways in which it transforms people's understanding and experience of the world, and really alters seems to alter possibly the place of poetry and imagination and the arts in the modern world. And you're right, he gives some very negative depictions of science there. This terrifying bird, predatory bird that picks out the eyes of the poet and chases all of the mythological creatures from the forest. And most often that poem is read as simply a kind of criticism of science, like John Keats, who wonders about the rainbow being unweaved by Newton and by science. And it's true, he does bring out the kind of frightening, destructive aspect of science. But what I insist on in my reading of that poem is that it's a series of questions, right? It starts with a declaration, true daughter of time thou art, who alters things with thy peering eye, but then begins to ask a series of questions, including the one that you point out, which is, how should a poet love thee, or how deem thee wise? And I think that's the central question. And rather than say it's impossible for a poet to love science or to deem it wise or smart or intelligent, Poe immediately starts out to try to answer that question. How can poetry and science live together in this age of Romanticism, as well as this age of the Industrial Revolution? What kinds of new forms, what kinds of new visions, what kinds of new ways of representing the world and thinking about the world and being in the world does science make possible to the poet? And I read almost all of his writing from this perspective, that there's an element of engaging with science and using its knowledge, using its techniques, using its effects as a way of heightening the effect of science. So, for instance, the magic lantern that I mentioned, it's this amazing new technology, a new scientific technology that uses the laws of optics. It's a new invention, has many new twists in the period that Poe's living, like dissolving views, where one image gives way to another. And I show how in a couple of Poe's stories, he's actually working with that special effect of taking one view and slowly fading it out into another view with that same brilliant color that's there in the magic lantern. So that's one way in which he's inspired by science. The descent into the maelstrom, one example. He's dramatizing in that story about a sailor who gets caught in the maelstrom, the whirlpool in the North Sea near Norway. He dramatizes a kind of method of induction. The sailor observes all the parts of the broken ship that are swirling around the maelstrom and sees that smaller ones go down slower. And so then, having learned this, he does the most unlikely, seemingly irrational thing. He jumps off the ship and he lashes himself to a barrel and jumps off the ship. And that's what saves him. So using some of the effects, dramatizing some of the methods of science, those are just two examples, but there are many, many more. And that's really what the book's all about.
Yeah, John, I appreciate how you ran the theme about the sonnet to science through much of the book, and I agree with what you concluded and what you just reported here. But I also want to add some other themes about that poem. And what we know about Poe right now is that this poem was written at a pretty early part of his life, where he was writing a lot of poetry. And the poem is, he's presenting the poet from a narrator, like as the third person. How should the poet think, how should the poet respond to science? And at first, he realizes it's a botheration, this science, I'm going back in my thesis. I actually went through your work here about the romantic machine and the potent magic of verisimilitude, where you talked about reason, the rational approach, and the dreamers. So I kind of think that Poe is at this crossroads in his life. He's trying to figure out what he can do with himself, and this science comes along, which is all over the news, and it's first distracting to him. But then I read this line a little bit. I put a little bit more into it. How should he, meaning the poet, and I'm specifically thinking he's thinking about himself there too. Let's say, how should I think the science think of science or deem thee wise? That's the central question in Poe's work, as you say. But I think it's also the central question in his decision about how to proceed in his career and how to exploit science too. How to take this thing that people are really wanting to read about, how to popularize it, as you write about too in your books. And he does. He exploits all of the new inventions that are coming up. He exploits all the new ideas, and even exploits the hoaxes and exposes some hoaxes, and then creates probably even more than he exploited. But I really think that's the central question of his work in this poem right now.
Terrific. Yeah, thanks a lot. I'm glad you agree. I'm not sure everyone does, because I'm not sure Richard does. There is a strong tradition of reading this poem as essentially a kind of romantic complaint against science. And although they're rhetorical questions, they're pretty harsh questions, right? Science is presented as a pretty difficult foe here, one that would be very, very hard to combat. Nevertheless, the Poe does try to, right? He follows this poem with the long poem that's the collection's named after, AlAraf, which is this very strange visionary poem, which is set on a star halfway between heaven and hell, using imagery from Islamic mythology. And he redefines that star in footnotes to this piece as the star that burst into view that was first seen by Tycho Brahe, the 16th century astronomer. So there's a way in which this long poem, which follows the kind of fantastic conventions of Romanticism, a visionary poem that's full of lots of sensory imagery, lots of strange longings, weird ways of thinking about light and darkness, and these flowers that burst into life and die, in many classic romantic poems. But it's inspired by this fact from the history of science, right? This star which appeared and then disappeared, which was a massive event. That's a huge discovery, because it suggested at the time that Tycho Brahe was writing that the heavens, which Aristotle and many people for centuries after him thought were unchanging, above the moon, the heavens don't change. If a star can burst into view and then disappear, then maybe the heavens have a history to them and can change as well. So it's a really fundamental discovery that feeds Poe as inspiration. So he follows that sonnet to science immediately with AlAraf, which is this romantic poem inspired by a fact of scientific observation. So I see that already as a way in which he's answering his own question, right? It's not by becoming a scientist, but by becoming a poet who understands and is inspired by science. And you're very right to point out the moment in his biography that poem is published, not necessarily when it's written, but when it's published, which is while he's waiting to get his appointment to West Point. So he's run away from John Allen's house, or he's been kicked out from Richmond, John Allen's house, and has joined the army, and then leaves the army. And with John Allen's help, this is sort of the last nice thing that John Allen does for him, one of the few, is he applies for a job or for a position at West Point, and you need a lot of letters of recommendation. And Allen has so many powerful friends in Virginia and in DC that he's able to secure him this post. But while he's waiting for that post to come through, Poe completes this collection and gets it published. And you're right, he's standing really at a crossroads. What's he going to do with his life? He's a young man. He's got, this quite a robust education, very high expectations for his role in public life that he's learned by being brought up by John Allan, this very prominent person in Richmond. And he's about to become an officer and an engineer at West Point. At the same time, he doesn't want to give up poetry. He doesn't want to give up fiction. Doesn't want to give up that role. So how can he combine those two roles? And that's really what I see him working through or trying to wrestle with, at least as he presents those poems at that moment.
Very good. Congratulations, John, on the book. And I am certainly convinced that science was a critical presence in Poe's life. The kind of question I have has to do with the actual work you did. Could you talk a little bit about how you decided to do this book and how you went about doing it? That is, the research that you did, and how did your views change, if they changed, and what did you find surprising as you did the work? That kind of process question that I think would be of great interest and certainly illuminate the book at the same time.
Yeah, thank you for the question. It's a book that I was sitting on for quite a long time. I've been working on and coming back to over a long time. It's when in graduate school, so over 20 years ago, I wrote an essay on Poe, The Poetic Magic of Verisimilitude, which was a response to me being given a copy of the science fiction of Edgar Allan Poe, which is this great Penguin collection. Harold Beaver, the editor, and I'm sure it's on the shelves at the Poe Museum. And reading it, knowing a little bit about Poe, having read him in junior high, like a lot of American students, and learning a little bit also about his importance for the history of literature, knowing that Baudelaire had translated him, but not knowing anything about his science writing or his science fiction. So the stories that were in that collection just blew my mind. I had no idea where they were coming from or what they were about. So I'm thinking of Magnetic Revelation in particular, which is this tale told from the point of view of someone who's been mesmerized and is in the world of the spirits, giving back the kind of secrets of the universe. And the facts in the case of Monsieur Valdemar, which is also a tale about mesmerism, which I didn't know anything about. Eureka, at the end of that collection, was the most puzzling, which was Poe's cosmology that he wrote near the end of his life. He gave us a lecture in 1848, which read as a kind of scientific treatise about the origins of the universe, with all kinds of other things going on in it, lots of clever jokes, lots of references to things I knew nothing about. And the footnotes that Beaver provides are extremely helpful, but also extremely tantalizing. They don't explain it all. It kind of assumes that you know the whole background story of what's going on in science in the 19th century in order to make sense, to explain what's going on in the stories. So as much as I was stimulated by those texts, I left it with many more questions. So that led me to begin to research a little bit and wrote that essay and wrote a few other essays about Poe himself. Meanwhile, I then wrote a book that Murray's kind enough to have mentioned, The Romantic Machine, which is about the exact same period, the early part of the 19th century, but this time in France. So that's the context in which Poe was translated. And a lot of the sources for what Poe's doing are coming from France. There's a lot of cross communication across the Atlantic. And of course, that's obvious for English culture affecting America and some American culture being picked up in England. But a lot of stuff coming from France is very influential. And that includes in the sciences, which France is really at the cutting edge of science in the early part of the 19th century. And Poe knows that. He's exposed to French literature and as well as French science at West Point. Most of the mathematics, a lot of the engineering, a lot of the astronomy is in French. So I wrote this book about France in the 19th century and the scientific debates, the different kinds of theories, the different metaphysics that are going on. And there I found that things that we think of as being associated with romanticism, like inspiration, emotions, the sense of all the world being connected as a living organism, different kinds of energies that are converted one into another. that this kind of way of seeing the world was very closely connected and in dialogue with new technologies and new sciences that were also trying to control and master the world, make sense of, but also harness those energies. And that's what the Romantic Machine was all about. But that combination of science, industry, technology, and Romanticism, I saw as very much echoing or anticipating what Poe was up to. Right? He's very much in the line of Romanticism. He knows his Coleridge, his Wordsworth, his Keats, his Shelley above all, and is very inspired by these authors and the philosophy behind them as well. But he's also got this engineering training. He's also got this fascination for astronomy, for physics, for chemistry, for natural history, and both of those things combined. So in a way, I'd written the book that was the background for Poe's translation into France, why he was received so enthusiastically in 1846, and then again in 1848 when Baudelaire reads him. And Baudelaire recognizes that he's an author really after his own heart, who fits right into this mix of science and Romanticism that's very important in Paris. And it also therefore explains what Poe's about. It winds up making sense of what Poe's doing, that he's drawing from this set of conversations that are happening across both sides of the Atlantic. And I felt then, having done that history of science, which is my real, disciplinary home, is as an historian of science, having done that background work, especially about the European contexts, I could then start to learn more about the American context for science and try to situate Poe within that. And there it was then a matter of learning a lot about the critical history of Poe, the different ways in which he's been studied, the new developments, reading your books, reading the collection on Pym, which was amazing, all the different perspectives brought together there, but also reading the history of American science. And I think the thing that really stood out and is really central to the book is this fundamental tension in American science. It's true in England and France, in Europe at the time, but it's much more exaggerated. It's much more fundamental in America, that there's this very deep tension between people who are trying to build a new structure for science, a new national framework of institutions like the American Association for the Advancement of Science, the Smithsonian Institute, eventually the National Academy of Sciences, the people who are working hard to try to set up that new federal framework, because there isn't one. There is no national framework for science. And on the other hand, this totally wild, unchecked public sphere of popular science, where people like P.T. Barnum, Dionysius Lardner, all kinds of new scientists, phrenologists, animal mesmerists are selling their wares in the public sphere, in journals, in museums, in lyceums, in newspapers, in public lectures. And those, to understand American science at that time, you really need to see both of those things. And that's part of what I learned, that, reading different sources on this, primary and secondary, those two perspectives hadn't really been brought together in the history of American science. Some people tell the historic or the heroic story of people like Joseph Henry, Alexander Dallas Bache, who's Benjamin Franklin's great-grandson, successfully setting up these institutions and defined science, American science, that way. Others focus on the public sphere, the Barnum-esque, the kind of circus-like elements of American science. But both are happening, and they're constantly in conversation and dialogue and vying against each other. And I realized that Poe actually lines up with both. Sometimes he's writing as somebody who's trying to set up this new national culture, these new institutions, these new authoritative spaces to say what's good and what's bad. In particular, he focuses on literature. He wants to be the kind of censor general of American letters and set up objective terms to decide what's good and bad scientific literature. But other times he very much aligns himself with those scientific institution builders and says, what we need is a new national university. What we need is to support the expedition to the South Pole, which is the first large-scale federally funded scientific expedition. But on the other hand, he's a forger in the other sense. And just as Murray said, he sometimes exposes hoaxes. Meltz's chess player, that trick of an alleged robot that seems to be able to play chess and beat all the best chess players in town. While he's in Richmond, he observes that, he sees that exhibition and writes this just burning criticism of it, saying there's no way that's real. There's no way someone could design a machine that could do that, which is true at the time. Of course, now people have designed machines that can play chess, but at the time it was right. So he's exposing that hoax. And then a few years later, he's writing hoaxes of his own, very much in the mode of P.T. Barnum. So to me, that was the biggest surprise, that there were these two currents, and you needed to see those two currents together to make sense of what American science was, and therefore to make sense of what Poe was up to. But on the other hand, that once you understand how Poe moved between those two positions, you really understood part of the mobility of his own writing, the fact that he's always changing voices, that he's always seemingly contradicting himself, or saying one thing and then saying the opposite. That makes sense in part because those fundamental tensions define the public sphere in America in the 1830s and 40s, which he's so much a part of. But I happily talk more about the process. Those are some of the bigger landmarks.
Yeah, I'd like to answer Richard's question with a quote that John Tresch concludes in The Romantic Machine. The intersection of romanticism and technology in this 19th century period could fruitfully be explored by focusing on writers like Frederick Schilling, Mary Shelley, and Edgar Allan Poe. I could see this from 2012. So obviously, John, you were already at least thinking about this all the way back then. We're talking about 10 years ago, right? And
Yeah.
when you were writing it, it had to be at least 10 years ago. But then that leads me to a question, all that you concluded. I was actually invited to a conference when I was doing my research on the History of Science Society, HSS, where I gave a talk on Edgar Allan Poe and 19th century science. I believe you were at that conference too. Anyway, historians were in disbelief, and their jaws were, American historians, jaws are open when I gave this talk, because nowhere in my research on history of American science was there a mention by any American author anyway. There was something in your book about Edgar Allan Poe. So my question then is, first of all, I think your book is the, I mean, the bee's knees or whatever, as far as a book about Poe and explaining, understanding Poe through the lens of science. It's just,
Thank you.
it's on and on of examples that I could think of, but and it does recognize Poe as somebody that needs to be really studied. You even mentioned here he's probably one of the most important people in early American literature, establishing so many genres of literature. But why do you think, this is my question, I don't want to draw this too long, that he's not been recognized as an important contributor of science in American history of science, or even generally in the way people write about, beside Beaver and a few others? I think, you know, Richard, you have some things in your books too, but, you know, John, your book totally explains that science is in almost all of his writing, his poetry, his fiction, but why is he so unrecognized in America, in his role in American history of science?
Yeah, there is another book. I mean, there are some authors who are aware of it, and there are some people like Rene Van Slooten, who's very much pushing the story of Poe, which I mentioned at the end of the book, as the founding figure, really, or the generator of the Big Bang Theory, because Eureka in a lot of ways resembles the Big Bang Theory, and it's pretty close to demonstrably certain that the main theorists of the Big Bang Theory would have read or at least been exposed to Eureka. So how much of a kind of smoking gun that is, I'll leave to others to debate, but it's part of the mix of what these very influential cosmologists are reading and are aware of. Of course, it's written in very different terms from the Big Bang Theory. It's written in extremely different terms than any of the physics of the late 19th or early 20th century. And that's the main reason why Eureka isn't recognized. He's doing something different. This isn't a theory that's rigorously argued in mathematical terms. There's math in it, but it's not, starting from basic principles and building up to explanations of observed facts. It's bringing facts in, but arguing that the way in which facts all make sense is completely dependent on having a good story, on having a good poetic framework, a good narrative to tie it all together. And even in 1848, although there are other authors associated with Romanticism who would agree with him on that fact, and many scientists making science popular in this way, by the late 19th and early 20th century, when people are beginning to write histories of science and histories of American science, that mode of writing is disqualified. And part of the reason why it's disqualified is because these new institutions that are taking shape in the late 1840s have kind of closed their ranks and said, here's what counts as science. That kind of speculative, poetic, romantic stuff doesn't belong. We deal with facts and we deal with mathematics. So there was a real kind of closure of what the scientific disciplines recognized as acceptable ways of arguing and acceptable ways of presenting themselves to the public. And once that line was drawn, Poe, not being connected with any institution, not having the same kinds of scientific connections and credentials, and not writing in the way that later scientists would recognize, just fell outside of it. So he's dropped off the radar. He didn't fit. I think it would be slightly unfair not to mention the fact that Eureka is also an extremely confusing, pretty crazy, pretty messy piece of work. So it isn't easily accessible, and nor is it easy, obviously, like true. It's what exactly he's saying is not always clear, and there are many things that are debatable within it, in its presentation, and even in much individual statements he makes. He makes certain mistakes here and there. So it's, even by early 19th century standards, it's out there. So that's another reason he isn't directly contributing to scientific journals. But one of the things that I think has started to shift in history of science is this recognition that science doesn't only happen in official journals or in official institutions or in the recognized narrative forms that scientists promote as the best and only ones. That what science is at any given time has a lot to do with its public image, a lot to do with how it relates to the rest of the world, how it justifies itself, how it explains itself, where its influences come from, which aren't always within science. And for that reason, that kind of broadened perspective on the history of science, like what science is in a historical moment, including the public sphere, including debates, including journalism and popular presentations, that broader sphere means that we have to recognize people like Poe as contributing to science, even if they're not directly inside the institution. So there, you may have seen it at HSS, there's also, there are talks about Barnum as a contributor to science, talks about things that we would now call pseudosciences, like animal magnetism or mesmerism. There's great work showing how closely connected that is to physics and closely connected to physiology. So people have broadened the sphere, and now I think, I'm sorry about that experience you had at HSS where their jaws dropped and they said, what are you talking about? I think now there's a little more acceptance that these more fringe figures are actually pretty important and pretty central. And part of what I do try to argue is that Poe actually isn't, at the time, fringe at all, because there isn't yet an institutional base. There isn't really a strong federal institution or center that he's at the outside of. So much of the science is happening in this kind of free-for-all public sphere of journals and magazines, and that's where he is. I don't know if that helps to answer.
Jaws dropping isn't necessarily bad. I had people coming up to me all day and offered to buy me drinks in the evening in the bar, and everybody wanted to hear more about it and to talk more about it. So, I did the best I could, but you did it much better in your book. So thank you.
Thank you. No, I think the history of science, the historians of science are very interested in things they haven't heard about. So I take it back. I'm glad you had a good time there, and I'm glad they appreciated what you did.
What is your favorite Poe story and why?
It's no question, it's The Domain of Arnheim, which is kind of a not a widely loved story and not widely known, but I pretty much dedicate a chapter to it in the book. An earlier version of it's called The Landscape Garden, and it's Poe's description of an artist who has unlimited wealth, unlimited capacity to work on the world, who realizes or decides that the best kind of work for an artist, the best field for the development of a truly inspired artist, isn't poetry or sculpture or music, but landscape gardening, remaking the landscape as a kind of three-dimensional poem. And the theory that he expounds is really interesting and dazzling and strange, that he thinks that the best kind of landscape garden, at least the one that he comes to mind for him, is one that looks like it's been made with the help of angels, that there's a kind of angelic interference to elevate the perception of nature 1 degree above human. So this is something greater and more sublime than humans could make, but not all the way to the level of what God would make. So, which is nature. And nature is actually sometimes hard to understand aesthetically. You go into a forest and it's just chaos, right? It's at the scale of God. That's not a scale we can relate to. So his idea is that you create a landscape garden that's just 1 level beyond what we can grasp, what we can aesthetically appreciate. So we have a sense of being lifted up intellectually, spiritually, to the perception that angels would have, which I think is Poe's idea for what great art is. It's the aim that he's after. It's the aim that he's following through all his poetry, throughout his short stories, to have this sense of some kind of work going on behind the scenes that's producing an uncanny experience, something more than merely material, but through material means, through the words on the page, through the sound of the poetry, through the kinds of machines, the kind of technology that produces the sensations. You're lifted to a space beyond the merely material. And to kind of convey that aesthetics, he then describes this domain of Arnheim, which is this trip through this kind of Disneyland, this kind of crazily symbolic Disneyland, which is sort of like an underworld or afterlife space, all these twists and turns of a boat on a river. And then finally, this last angelic revelation of this final scene, the final domain of Arnheim. It's not a normal story in any way. It doesn't have a lot of suspense. There aren't really characters except for this art theorist at the start, but I feel like it's a story that's extremely close to Poe's heart, and I think it's one that is really effective as a transporting tale that gives you a sense of what he's trying to do in transporting the reader, and actually does it. And I think it's historically such an interesting vision of nature being elevated by just one degree, because this is the moment of, in the US, transforming the landscape with canals, with railroads, with roads, and thinking about what are the kind of dangers of transforming nature. How can it go too far? How can you reduce nature and make it something ugly and destroy it? Versus how can you work with nature to make something that's beautiful, in line with nature, that somehow also elevates it, brings a kind of human aesthetic touch to it. And I think that's the central question for Poe, and it's one that's drawn from what's going on historically in science and technology at his time, but he gives his own really particular aesthetic spin on it. So yeah, I love that story, and I wish more people would read it and comment on it.
Well, everybody out there who's watching this, be sure to read The Domain of Arnheim and write down in the comments what you think about it. Looks like we have maybe time for one more question, if anybody has a question or comment.
Could you talk a little bit about the work you're doing now, the next project?
Thanks for the question. I'm inspired by Eureka, which is this outlandish cosmology that shows up in the middle of the 19th century, drawing on all these sources, combining aesthetics, combining literary theory and art theory and all the sciences to do a history of images of the cosmos and tell a history of science through those kinds of stories or pictures or architectural forms or landscape gardens where people try to explain or convey what's in the universe, where does it come from, where is it headed, how's it made, what holds it together. And I think Poe is an important contributor to that story, but it's a story that stretches over 500 years. The early days of modern science, different configurations of materialism, of mechanism, of holism, of romanticism, where are subjects, where are objects, and just kind of compare different images of the universe as a different way of telling that history of science, to show really how the aesthetic has always been part of the scientific all the way through, that has produced different kinds of cosmologies, different kinds of syntheses. So it kind of combines art history with the history of science and literary forms, but also these questions of how are these images conveyed to people? Where do they show up? And the relations between science and the public. And the 19th century is just full of these kinds of cosmological representations, and Poe's one of them. But stretch it all the way up to the present. So Stephen Hawking will be in there, Carl Sagan's Cosmos, and other attempts now to make sense of the cosmos, especially as we're seeing the kind of consequences of industrialization and climate change. How do we think of nature as something that's not just out there for us to study and make use of, but as something that is really affected by us, and where our intentions can transform it in very dangerous, unexpected, catastrophic ways? I think my sense is that we need to rethink where we stand in relation to nature. And then the kind of guiding question is, what new representations of the cosmos will make it possible to represent that new relationship to nature in a way that's not destructive, but in a way that can be more harmonious. And there I'm also following Poe to an extent.
Sounds great. Look forward to reading it.
Yeah. Joseph Campbell writes about societies going back thousands of years that had depictions of the universe, from the Egyptians to the Native Americans, different island people. And one of the things he points out is how similar that some of the depictions of the heavens are in different cultures that obviously had no exposure to one another. But I was wondering if you talked about 500 years, or are you considering going back to some mythology too?
Yeah. I'm struggling with the first chapter, which sort of has to do everything before 1490, and that's a lot to fit into one chapter, but very much so. Yeah, mythology, religions, and the term I'm using in the book, cosmograms, represent images of the cosmos. That's been used in histories of religion, in comparative mythology, also in psychology. What's the image that any individual has of the universe? But it hasn't really been applied to Western science, right? Which presents itself as not being a cosmology. I mean, it's just the way things are. It doesn't see itself as having this aesthetic and really religious aspect to it. And by juxtaposing those different images, exactly as you suggest, is to show that there is responsibility to shape that image of the universe. It's not just given. And we have to think about science as something that's created, that has ethics and politics to it, in order to produce it, to create it in such a way that we take some responsibility for it. And all those earlier examples or other parallel examples that you mentioned can feed into that. And again, Poe's, in Eureka, he gives a kind of telescoped history from the Egyptians to the Greeks to Kepler, and histories of cosmology are really condensed in his own piece, which he's borrowing from Alexander von Humboldt, who kind of coins the term cosmos or brings it into public discussion right while Poe's writing. And Poe dedicates Eureka to Alexander von Humboldt for that reason. But right at that time, when cosmos comes out, the word is not widely used, but Humboldt, by giving a history of images of the cosmos, puts it into circulation. And that's Poe's starting point too. Meanwhile, his brother is a historian, Wilhelm von Humboldt is an historian of philology and mythologies and languages worldwide. So there's really a cross pollination between history of science and history of religion and history of mythology, just as you suggest, which I'm going to draw on, but the challenge is to do it briefly. But speaking of works in progress, I know Richard's got a Poe biography on its way, which is I'm looking forward to immensely. And I think one of the issues is what size and scale it's going to be. But my biggest question, Richard, if I may ask you, is is there a particular line that you're following? Is there what's your focus? What's the how do you want to tell the story?
Well, I want to tell the story with with authority and with briskness. So, there's a constant tension between, wanting to analyze and wanting to move along. And perhaps that tension is productive. I'm hopeful it is. And, I think that part of my interest is the way in which he reintegrates his life in his work. And much of that has been acknowledged. I'll expand on that and give a focus to that rather than the theme of disintegration that we've seen treated going back to Lawrence. I want to show a kind of healthy bringing to bear an artist's sorcery on the lived life.
Definitely. That sounds great. And you can see it in everything he writes, how it's about making sense of his own situation, his own ongoing struggles. And I think taking that question of integration versus disintegration, and holism and unity versus disintegration, taking that head on is fantastic. It makes perfect sense. We're looking forward to that too.
Great.
Well, it looks like the hour is coming to a close. So I want to thank you, John, for joining us this week and sharing a little bit about his latest book, which you can purchase right now at shop.poemuseum.org. And I believe we still even have some of the copies with his signature in them. And I want to thank Richard Kopley for joining us. And we all look forward to seeing the Poe biography whenever it's done. And Murray Ellison, thanks for joining us again. We hope to see you dressed up as Auguste Dupin at another Unhappy Hour. And for all of you out there in Poe land, thanks for joining us. And please, if you have any questions, just put them down in the comments and we'll pass them on to John or to Richard or to Murray. But again, thanks everyone for coming out today to learn more about this fantastic new book.
Thank you, Chris.
Thanks for putting it on, Chris,
Thanks so much. Yeah.
and the Poe
And thanks,
Museum.
Murray. Absolutely.
So I'm
It's a
gonna-
real pleasure to have spoken here. I'm so glad to be part of the museum.